Charles Leclerc had a nightmare in Miami. Despite recovering to a pretty decent P7 finish all things considered, he crashed in FP2, he crashed at the end of Q3, and at the end of the race he was left confused by the balance of his car. The topic of Leclerc crashing has always been a fiery one. He is a driver of immense speed and ability, but you can't ignore that these mistakes are not just creeping in, but they're beginning to feel like a pattern. Looking back at his history of incidents, whilst I could name every single time Leclerc's car either touched the barrier or another car, I want to actually be realistic. I'm not going to include crashes that in my opinion were not his fault. So, for example, Hungary 2021 or maybe controversially Brazil 2019. And I'm not going to include crashes in practice because that's the only time where pushing the boundaries and getting caught out is understandable. In 2019, he had major incidents in Monaco during the race, during qualifying at Baku, during qualifying in Hungary, and crashing out in the wet in Germany. In 2020, he took his teammate out in Styria, crashed out in Monza, took Stroll out in Russia, and crashed into Checo and Verstappen in Sakir. But remarkably, of course, that was the race that Checo went on to win, despite being taken out and being last on the opening lap. 2021 was a relatively clean year from Leclerc's point of view, with his crash in qualifying in Monaco. That was the only major incident. However, that one crash turned out to be a costly one as, despite qualifying on pole, his drive shaft broke on the laps to the grid as the team weren't able to find the issue whilst the car was being repaired, meaning he wasn't able to start the race. In 2022, Leclerc, at least for the first half of the season, had a title-challenging car. However, he still crashed in Imola trying to chase down Checo. He did also have a spin during quali in Spain, but despite that, he still managed to set pole position with his last run. And then there was the big one, crashing at the French Grand Prix whilst in the lead of the race. In 2023, so far Leclerc spun out on the opening lap in Australia when he collided with Stroll. He also crashed out at the end of sprint quali in Baku, despite still securing the pole for the sprint, and then of course most recently crashed out during the final run in qualifying at Miami. Looking back, the crash at the French Grand Prix stands above the rest as the most painful and the most soul-crushing because of all of the context that surrounded that incident. Apart from the drama of crashing from the lead, Leclerc was just coming off a win on Red Bull soil in Austria. Getting his first back-to-back win of the season would have been huge and maybe could have started to build some momentum. But that crash ended any chances of a title comeback, and even as Max admitted later in the season, it was that crash from the lead of the race that finally made him think that the title was his. When it comes to the question of is Leclerc crash prone, the answer is undoubtedly yes. Now, some fans have took it way too far online and have started to compare Leclerc's record to that of Latifi's and Schumacher's, and that is a comparison that I just can't take seriously because in terms of talent, speed, achievements, and everything else that matters, Leclerc's name shouldn't even be mentioned with the other two. The problem is, when you then start comparing Leclerc to the level of drivers that I think he does belong in the conversation with, Alonso, Verstappen, Hamilton, against those three, that's when his record of incidents starts to worry me. And now, to say that none of them have ever made a mistake would be ridiculous because, of course they have, but Leclerc just seems to make more than them. And when push comes to shove in a tight upper midfield battle like we have this year between Aston Martin, Mercedes and Ferrari, those mistakes look even more costly when it's so close. When you dig deep into why Leclerc makes so many mistakes relative to the other drivers that I think are on his level, it feels like it's intrinsic to the way he drives. I've said before on my channel, and I still stand by this now, that Leclerc over one lap is the fastest driver in F1 right now. He's so good at being able to push and live on that limit, especially around street tracks, and it feels like he's more able than anyone else to live with instability. His teammate is a great comparison because in the races, Carlos Sainz is one of the most reliable Grand Prix drivers around. But over one lap, if everything is not right with the feeling of the car, Sainz just can't manufacture confidence and speed in the same way that Leclerc can to extract performance out of the car. The problem is that when you're constantly at that limit, when you then get greedy or get impatient and push even more, that is exactly when an F1 car just bites. In Imola in 2022, Leclerc at the chicane in very tricky damp conditions was taking way more curb than anyone else. On one lap he took it even further, the car couldn't live with it and he lost it. Even Checo and Lando in the cool-down room after the race watching the replay were surprised with how fast Leclerc was taking that corner. In Miami this year during qualifying, if you compare how much inside curb Leclerc is taking on the lap that he crashed compared to Checo's pole lap, it's crazy how much further on the curb Leclerc is. In the end, as Anthony Davidson pointed out on Sky whilst breaking down the incident, the car just bottoms out, loses downforce, and then you're just along for the ride as a passenger heading into the barrier. Leclerc knows himself that in qualifying, he takes more risks than any other driver, saying as much after the crash.
You can always find excuses in those situations. The wind was really strong, it was really tricky. The setup of the car was really tricky also, but I put myself in this condition. I wanted this setup and I knew it would be tricky, but I thought I would be able to extract the maximum out of the car in Q3, which is normally one of my strong points. I know also that I'm taking more risk than others probably in Q3, and that's why most of the time I'm doing good Q3s, but this is too much, and again, very disappointed with myself. I did the same mistake yesterday and this shouldn't happen.
He does also mention the car aspect as well, and although he takes responsibility for the setup direction being his choice, Ferrari also has a big role to play in Leclerc's incidents. It's clear listening to both Sainz and Leclerc that in 2022 and 2023, the Ferrari is just a tricky car to drive. It's carried over those traits from last year of being a stronger car in qualifying than the race due to its random balance and tyre wear. But because the fight in the upper midfield is even closer this year, I think it's exposing and highlighting those weaknesses even more. Ferrari need to make a car that is both faster and also works better across a range of conditions, because it doesn't feel that the drivers have that much confidence to really be able to push it on every single different track that we go to. It's very difficult as a fan to know where that line is in the sand and who's more to blame. I have always put more of the responsibility on the driver side, because at the end of the day, it's your job, especially as one of the best drivers in the world, to know where the limit of your car is and to get the best out of it. Ferrari is by no means blameless because they are underperforming yet again, and they need to understand that they have a window of opportunity with a driver as good as Leclerc on their team that they're wasting. But Leclerc also needs to do better. It's also by no means a guarantee that even if Ferrari did have a better car, that the incidents would go away. Last year, with a competitive race-winning car at the beginning of the year, he still made crucial mistakes. But how much of that was down to Ferrari underperforming and the pressure that it put on Leclerc to almost overcompensate, which led to those mistakes, is difficult to judge. Leclerc is still a driver who's developing and improving, and this Ferrari team is exactly the same. Yes, they're not where they want to be, and Leclerc occasionally putting it into the wall is going to cost them, but as I said on Twitter after the race, I will take the trade-off of Leclerc occasionally crashing, because the talent and the speed that he possesses has got Ferrari more results than his mistakes have taken away. Make no mistake, however, that does not excuse his crashes. When I put Leclerc on the same level as Alonso and Hamilton, that means that I have to judge him by the harshest standards possible, because that's what happens when you're one of the best drivers on the grid. When Alonso was driving actual tractors like the 2014 Ferrari or the countless McLaren Hondas, he was driving a car that was just as difficult as any car Leclerc has ever driven, and he never had as many incidents as Leclerc has had, despite still delivering at a high level. Your job is to perform and extract the maximum possible within the limits of whatever car you're given, just as it's the team's job to give you a car worthy of your talent. Leclerc has over-delivered at times at Ferrari, which is why it's frustrating to not see him in more competitive cars. But that's also why when he does get the balance of risk versus reward wrong, it's an even bigger disappointment than say seeing Sainz have an identical incident. Both Leclerc and Ferrari still have a long way to go to get each other into the best environment possible to win championships. But as much as Ferrari needs to improve, Leclerc needs to also improve and find a better balance, because his tag as a crash-prone driver, despite how talented he is, isn't going away anytime soon.